Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week we're sharing an interview with Garret Felber, author of the book A Continuous Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Martin Soster, which came out May 5th from AK Press. Garret spoke about the life of Martin Soster, famed jailhouse lawyer who successfully won cases related to the constitutional rights of prisoners, was politicized in prison by the Nation of Islam in the 1950s, ran radical Afro-centric bookstores in Buffalo, New York to radicalize the youth, embracing anarchism during his time imprisoned on a frame-up, during which he was a celebrated political prisoner, resisting cavity searches through the courts and through direct action. And he went on to organize after his release for tenants' rights and rehabilitating disused buildings for community centers and helping run a childcare. Sostre was a mentor to Lorenzo, Komb'oa-Ervin, and Ashanti, Alston, and many others, and laid important foundations for modern Black Anarchism in the U.S. There's a lot in here, and we hope that you enjoy the book and that the story inspires complex, creative, and combative resistance to all forms of domination. The transcript for this chat is currently up in the blog post at our website, and soon we'll have a zine and a PDF up there as well, and on the zine page. So let's start with a quick announcement about Kevin Rashid Johnson. Rashid was compacted on May 1st to the Perry Correctional Institution in South Carolina, 430 Oak Lawn Road, Peltzer, South Carolina, 29669. His ID number in South Carolina is 397279. In the transit van, he was severely injured, probably a broken bone, to his left leg. He's not been given any treatment for it as far as I'm aware. He is in solitary confinement with only a concrete slab to sleep on. He can make only one phone call per week. A comrade is helping to get him into GTL's Getting Out app so that he can communicate with everyone. Meanwhile, he has been on hunger strikes since he got there, and he's lost 17 pounds in just the first week. He is appealing for maximum publicity and pressure. The numbers listed for the prison are 864-243-4700 and 803-737-1752. It's requested that people make calls and spread the word. Kevin Rashid Johnson, Rashid is in quotes, ID number 397279, must be treated humanely, given good medical care and a decent place to sleep, and allowed full access to communicate with his lawyers and supporters. They ask that you tell authorities to meet his demands so he can end his hunger strike. Would you introduce yourself for the audience with your name, pronouns, location, and any affiliations that you want to share?
Yeah, of course. My name's Garret Felber. I use they pronouns. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I organize with Study and Struggle and the Committee to Free the Mississippi 5.
Cool. Thank you so much for having this conversation and for the work that you do. Before we get to the book that we're going to talk about, A Continuous Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Martin Soster, which is due out in May from AK Press, I wonder if you could talk about Study and Struggle and that committee that you mentioned and sort of the work that y'all do.
Yeah, of course. Happy to. Study and Struggle was an organization that I was a part of co-founding in 2020. We support radical study groups in prisons, predominantly in Mississippi, but also in Washington and New York. Also involved in putting out print publications like In the Belly. And the Committee to Free the Mississippi 5 launched this last August. It's a campaign to free 5 women who were sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in the late 80s and early 1990s. And they were due up for parole after 10 years and have since been denied between 7 and 14 times each. So among them, they've been denied almost 50 times. So yeah, that work is ongoing. And actually, Linda Ross just went up on Wednesday and we're waiting to hear back about that. So fingers crossed.
And I'll definitely put links in the show notes to what you can give me on those groups so that folks can learn more. But I'm just kind of curious with the with Study and Struggle. So like our local ABC has tried a couple times and unsuccessfully to get going an inside-outside study group. And I don't know if that's what Study and Struggle is mostly focused on, or just focused on getting the materials to folks based on what their desires are, and then helping facilitate folks getting new content. We were sort of starting off based on the local prison books chapter. They had an inside-outside study group because they're sending to tons of prisoners already. They ask people like, hey, are you interested in reading this? We'll get you a copy of this book or this zine or whatever. And then do this cool, like if they can't get participants live on a phone call during one of their meetings on the outside, then they'll get written, because people are going to read stuff at their own pace and they may have different levels of access to phones and such. We'll just maybe in some cases get like a written version or whatever, and then put together a zine of people's thoughts and feelings about what they've read, and send that zine in further with that book so that folks can start their own study groups maybe inside, which I think is a really cool model. But we've had no success actually getting like feedback from prisoners about wanting to participate. But yeah, so that very long aside, I'd love to hear a little bit about the way that you negotiate this, your structure, and also how you're getting around the like mail digitization and like limitations on materials getting in that's been more and more, which is pertinent to this conversation about Martin Soster also.
Yeah, it's shifted a little bit since the beginning. We started as supporting and facilitating inside-outside groups when we started in 2020, and that's shifted quite a bit over the years, just realizing the bandwidth necessary to be both helping people outside with reading groups and inside. So it's really shifted a lot towards just sending materials, dealing with the censorship issues, putting money on people's books. There's a phone line where people can call and connect and get, support that way, whether it's emotional, financial, whatever. And yeah, the mail digitization, it's so state by state. So Mississippi, where most of our folks are, they're kind of late to that game. Only in the last year or so did people get tablets. They've started photocopying the mail and giving people photocopies only instead of the originals. But largely what we're sending in are books, and then, maybe a zine or study guide or something like that. And yeah, it's just been, we had an entire year at most of the people that we support in Mississippi are at the state designated women's prison. And we had an entire year where not a single thing got through. So we did a phones app and they wound up sending 23 boxes of books back. So it is not without its challenges. And like I said, it's so state by state. So we've got different challenges in New York, where there's actually like a different censorship infrastructure. And it just looks different depending on where you're struggling.
Because you mentioned In the Belly, could you talk about that project a little bit too?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to talk about In the Belly. The folks who work with that within Study and Struggle, Safir Ness, who was among the folks who started it inside. But it's a print publication that's entirely edited and written by incarcerated folks and sent inside prisons. And I believe there should be the next issue coming out pretty soon.
Cool. I'll definitely put some links in the show notes for that. And they also are affiliated with, I think, In the Mix podcast too, which features heavily conversations with various incarcerated revolutionaries on a number of different topics. It seems like a kind of like hit or miss on the timing about, it's not like a regular podcast, but there's some really fruitful conversations that happen that I think like everyone should give a listen to. So yeah, I would like to talk about the book, A Continuous Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Martin Soster. Congratulations on this book coming out. That's super exciting. I wonder if you could paint kind of a thumbnail sketch of Martin's life and share how you came to write this biography.
Yeah, the thumbnail of Martin's life might be, I'll try not to do 20 minutes. I feel like in some ways, even after writing like a 400-page biography, there's so much more to be known and develop about Martin's ideas in life. Like there were whole sections where I just felt like I wanted to give a chapter to something that's actually a sentence. I share a little bit in the introduction about how I came to know about Martin's life. It was just a kind of random connection. I was working on my dissertation on the Nation of Islam's organizing in prisons, and I came across Martin's name in a letter from an incarcerated Muslim who was writing to Malcolm X, and they were all being held in solitary confinement because of their religious beliefs, and there was an upcoming trial. So he was writing to Malcolm to try and get him to be a key witness. And so this was probably early 2010 to 2011. And I Googled Martin's name, and there was a very bare bones Wikipedia page that came up. And it mostly focused on Martin's frame up in Buffalo and his time as a political prisoner. So I was really interested in this earlier period where he was in the Nation of Islam in the late 50s, early 60s. And then I was like, wow, this is fascinating that he became a political prisoner and ran a bookstore. And so I wrote to him. I found his address and I wrote to him, and he just sent me back like this letter with all these like primary sources. I mean, it was like a revolutionary newsletter that he had published in solitary confinement at Wallkill. And then it was this photo of him and Sandy Shivak with preschoolers in the 90s. And he basically said, I was trying to interview him at the time. And he basically said, I'm too busy. And he's like 90 at the time. He said, I'm too busy, but these documents will tell you everything you need to know. And so I sort of just stayed in touch with him a few times via letter. And unfortunately, he had a stroke a year or two later and then passed away in 2015. And so I just stayed in touch with his family and really just eventually came to the conclusion that I needed to write a biography. So in terms of his life, he grew up in Great Depression era Harlem. I talk in the book about the possible influences that had on his political life. He was drafted into World War II and became politicized through that process. But then especially while in jail, he met Julio Pinto Gandia, who was a revolutionary nationalist Puerto Rican lawyer. And then shortly after that, he becomes incarcerated on a 6 to 12-year sentence in New York State, joins the Nation of Islam, and really teaches himself law and becomes an important jailhouse lawyer. So that's sort of this period where he's more of a politicized prisoner. And he gets out in 1964, moves to Buffalo, starts a chain of radical bookstores there, and then gets framed in the long, hot summer of 1967 and gets this, virtual life sentence. I mean, he gets a 30 to 40-year sentence. And then we're into the quote unquote political prisoner years, although I try to complicate in the book that binary. And he continues to win important cases for prisoners' rights. His politics shift during that period from, revolutionary Black nationalism to more Maoism to anarchism. And I discuss that in the book. And then he eventually wins clemency and his release in late 1975. He's released in 76. And then he just lives this long chapter of his life as a tenant organizer in New York and doing youth mentorship in New Jersey. And so, for me, the book was fascinating for many reasons and him as a figure, but I just think he so encapsulates the arc of what a life of continuous struggle looks like and the political development that goes along with that and the shifting terrains of both the political landscape that he's operating in and how he's reacting to it. So yeah, that's my brief sketch of 92 years of continuous struggle.
Good job. That was brief. There's a distinction that you make in there that I didn't actually come across in the book, but I recall this being attributed to Martin. We can talk about this later on in the conversation if you want, but the distinction, and this comes out in chapter headings, between politicized prisoners and political prisoners. And maybe I'm misremembering that attribution, but could you talk a little bit about that and where that concept comes from in Martin's work and like how he applied it and how it's like understood today?
Yeah, so he talks about it in the short documentary film about him, Frame Up, which came out towards the end of his incarceration in 1974. And he talks about the difference between a politicized prisoner and a political prisoner. And he doesn't explicitly say how it applies to himself. But I would say through other speeches and writings, he saw himself as a political prisoner and understood political prisoner in kind of like what we might understand in the classical way of like being imprisoned for your political views or actions. And obviously his first sort of 6 to 12-year sentence where he's incarcerated for selling heroin and then becomes politicized in prison through, his readings and organizing the Nation of Islam, that sort of maps on to being a politicized prisoner. And I guess in the course of writing the book, I had actually sort of titled the chapters in that way, because I was like, oh, this works so perfectly. He's got this whole, time where he's a politicized prisoner and this time where he's a political prisoner. And I just came to sort of be troubled by the neatness of that when actually comparing it to the messiness of what was happening, which is that, he's up for parole actually after 4 years of his 6 to 12 year sentence through earned time. And it's because of his affiliation with the Nation of Islam and his lawsuits and organizing that he gets set off by the parole board. And then he, winds up in solitary confinement for the last 5 years and does his full 12 years. And so I started thinking, well, and a lot of this came from conversations with Stevie Wilson too. And it just became really obvious to me that he was already sort of a political prisoner during that first term because the state was responding to his organizing with imprisonment, and that there's not just this idea of like, that you can be held in prison for your political ideas, even while already being in prison. So I tried to get some of that nuance out in those chapters as well.
When he addresses that distinguishing between those, and I guess the distinguishing character being, what are you going in for? Like, what are you facing when you go in? Because it's like, in both cases, it's technically for heroin distribution. Although in the second one, it's clearly a manufactured, like, police frame up, as the title of the film describes. Does he make the distinction towards the responsibility of the movement towards an individual being a politicized prisoner being different from that of a political prisoner, or the amount of trust that should be given to someone based on why they go inside and how much they're going to actually follow through on, their political commitments?
Yeah, I mean, it's inconsistent over time. I mean, so he writes in his essay, The New Prisoner, he writes, "We are all political prisoners." And it's, very much in that post-Attica moment where that argument's being made that the political conditions for, all people, especially people of African descent who are imprisoned, is a political one. So there he makes that argument. And then, a few years later, he's really making the argument that there has to be a hierarchy or a priority basis of who's supported. And he's arguing that, the Puerto Rican nationalists have been in for 20 years and people in the movement need to support them. So it's not like a consistent thread throughout his life. And I do think that he distinguishes a little bit more than I might in my own organizing. But yeah, I think he would see someone who, like himself, who became politicized inside as, needing that support in the way that you're describing.
And we're also, I'm asking you kind of an unfair question because A, he's not here to answer that himself, or, and B, this was over, as you said, like a 92-year lifespan when he went through so many different adaptations to his experience of the world and his feeling of like how he wanted to uphold himself through that, and how his struggle would look, that like to make some sort of overarching distinguishing like period at the end of the sentence thing about his view on political versus politicized prisoners is kind of an unfair question anyway. But yeah, I was hoping to offer some space here if you want to talk about your elder and comrade, Sandy Shivak, who just passed. He'll come into questions a little bit later as we talk about the period of time when Martin and Sandy's lives overlapped. But I wonder if you want to say anything about him and his contribution to the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for offering the space for that. Yeah. All of us who know and love Sandy have been really stunned by his passing, which was just a few days ago. He was one of the very first people that I contacted when I decided to start this project. And I remember when I called him, he basically said, "I've been waiting for your call." He was like, "I already know who you are. I know that you're interested in Martin." He just, from that moment on, that was in 2020, was just so embedded in this project. And and he was so generous, I think, not only to me and through the process and just making sure that part of Martin's life, it was really unclear to me, I guess, to go back to that earlier story, right? Of what is this image of Martin at a preschool in the, I guess I said 90s, it was the early 2000s. But I sort of knew that piece of his life existed, and it was important to me to draw that continuity to his earlier life. But I wasn't quite clear when I set out on the project of how much continuity there was, and also how much work had happened in New Jersey from, the 80s to the early 2000s. And so Sandy just was the key to unlocking all of that. I mean, he was still in touch with all of these young folks that he and Martin had mentored who are now in their 50s. We drove around, I visited him, and he took me around Passaic and Patterson and looked at all the different buildings that they had rehabilitated and turned into a community center and affordable housing and a preschool. And so he was just such a part of the living legacy of Martin and such a connective tissue to all of that. And then throughout the whole process, like absolutely like humble doesn't even really describe it. Like he was so modest about his own role in it because Martin was a mentor to him. I mean, he met Martin when he was in his early 20s, and he had such a care and reverence for Martin. And I should say, despite like they had a really hard falling out where they didn't speak for the last 20 years of Martin's life. And that weighed really heavily on Sandy. And so for him to approach this, despite that, with like the tenderness and care that he had for Martin and Martin's family and me, I mentioned to you, like he called me probably every 3 to 5 days for 5 years. And and sometimes I would just laugh because he'd call me on a Monday and say, how's the book coming? And call me on a Wednesday and say, how's the book coming? I'm like, Sandy, I haven't even done anything since our last call, Anyway, so I could go on and on about what a mensch Sandy was, but it's just a devastating loss for so many folks. And that's just like his contribution to this book and this piece of, he's one of those people who's doing like 900 other things in his community that I could not speak to, but others could. So, yeah.
I'm glad that his experience and like some of his flavor comes out in this book. That's the closest I'll have come to knowing him, but really appreciate what came through. Let's see. So, to my understanding, this is the first full biography of Martin Soster. I first heard about Sostre maybe 15 years ago when I found a video of Framed Up, the imprisonment of Martin Soster, on the Christie Books website, where there was a collection of different videos that were about anarchism or anarchists or of interest to anarchists based out of the UK. And then his name started coming up around histories for me around Black Anarchism that I was coming across. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about the general public amnesia about him and like that you're trying to remedy with this book.
Yeah, I similarly around the same time came across Martin and found Frame Up. And a funny thing about Frame Up, just anecdotally, is, it's a film by a couple of anarchist filmmakers, Pacific Street Films, Steve and Joe. And what's funny about it is that they made the film not knowing that Martin was an anarchist. And so, yeah, just the fact that never really came up, and it doesn't really necessarily come through in the film unless you sort of have that context. So yeah, when I came across Martin, like I said, there wasn't much about him out there. It mostly focused on the Frame Up in Buffalo. And then when I started talking to people and doing oral histories, it was like, if you talk to any radical of the 60s and 70s, they immediately know Martin, at least by name, So I felt like part of the amnesia was a generational one. It was like there had not been this sort of cultivating generation by generation of who Martin was and why he was significant. It was just like this group of people for whom he was up there with George Jackson, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, like in that same pantheon of folks. And then there was just this drop off during the period where he was, basically just doing community organizing in New Jersey. And even within the interviews with those, I talked about Sandy's humility, but there's also Martin's humility. So I would talk to these kids who were, like 14 to 18 working with Martin for years. And I would interview them and say I was working on this biography, and they only knew Martin as this like 70 and 80-year-old who worked on construction projects in New Jersey. And I would mention like him being a political prisoner, and some of them were like, what are you talking about? Or like, whoa, like they had no idea about Martin's earlier life. Or they would say like, yeah, I knew he was in prison, but So I think there was just that general sense of like generational loss of an elder who meant so much to so many ideas and people. And then there's kind of the secondary one, which is like, even if people knew his name, or even if they knew a sketch of his life, it wasn't really clear, even to me, certainly when I started it, of like, what were his unique political ideas? How were those disseminated throughout the movement? What was his impact? So I think one of the things I was trying to get through with the book was also an intellectual history of his thought. And, it was just like, he would be listed as a key thinker in the development of Black anarchism. But then it was like, I couldn't find a writing of his about anarchism, or like what he had developed, or who he had, you just sort of knew like maybe Lorenzo and that connection in more recent years, because Lorenzo's been talking more publicly about that relationship. But it just felt like such a missing connection, and just a need to develop what Martin's ideas were and what his life and actions were as well.
I think that humility is a really interesting part too, because a bunch of those people that you mentioned in that pantheon are folks that Angela Davis was a public intellectual, then went on trial in relation to George Jackson, and was persecuted publicly as a communist and a black communist woman at that in the 60s by Reagan and such. And so like that's a reason for her to get known. George Jackson, obviously, like I think his time in the limelight was like pretty short and explosive, and published 2 books and was in the fervor, and then was snuffed out, like murdered. And so it makes sense that he was not necessarily even doing self-promotion, besides just like the resolution of these legal cases and the end of these and the liberation of his people. Like all these things are tied up. But with Martin Sostre's like political like self-promotion, at least as featured in the book, it's like he comes up when he is facing the power of the state in these legal proceedings, and he is literally in most cases, one of the named defendants in this case, or what have you. Like, he's named in the case, so he has to be at the forefront, and it becomes about him. But the rest of the time, that like it doesn't say like Afro-Asian bookstore in exile brought to you by Martin Sostre. Like, he's not forefronting his personality in any of that stuff, or in Jeep or whatever. I think that maybe that says a lot about the way that somebody understands their role in society and within political movement. Yeah. And also, and I guess it ties maybe to like if he's approached by you and you're interested in like getting a biography out, and then he's just like, here's some materials, I'm busy doing other stuff to talk about myself. If he avoided or maybe didn't know how to do that, that's just curious, because the rest of our society is all about self-promotion, and it's all about people making names for themselves, and influencers at this point being a term that people use. So I think that maybe just says a lot, maybe about the time that he came from, the community that he came out of, or maybe just about him personally. I don't know if you want to speculate on that or just let it sit and stew.
No, but there's an anecdote that comes to mind as you're saying that, which is, I think both Ashanti Alston and Cisco Torres told me similar things. There was a group that I came across in the 90s that was just being referred to as The Collective. It was in Yuri Kochiyama's papers that I came across it. And it seemed like it was basically ex-Panthers, ex-BLA, and maybe around the time of like Jericho. And so it was those folks trying to support political prisoners who were still inside. And I was asking Ashanti and Cisco, do you remember these like meetings or what you all were doing? And it was kind of hazy. But both of them basically said, like, Martin was an elder for them, and a really important one, but you wouldn't know who he was in the room unless you did know. Like, it wasn't like he came into the space and said, it was just like he just came, he did the work, and it was like, oh, was that Martin Soster? Like, people just really were like, oh, wow, okay. Yeah, he was just really interested in doing the work. And that was something that came through across all the different political development in his life. He was just very, very action-oriented, results-oriented, not interested in celebrity at all.
Lacking a lot of details of his life, I think that you do a really good job of filling in the context and development by looking at those events, that he did participate in and the people around him as well, which feels like an apt sort of tribute to his own humility and views on social change and movement, maybe. Can you talk about the influences that help politicize Sostre, the sort of sea that he swam in, that you go into detail? I mean, I just, like, another aside, the beginning of the book, I think, is just riveting. I grew up on the West Coast, and so these descriptions of developments in Harlem and like the Puerto Rican community, and also the communities and the leftist communities, and like the remnants of the Garveyite movement and how that moved forward in the early Communist Party, like all these things coalescing, I thought was just like fascinating to read about.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I had a lot of anxiety about the first 40 years of his life. It was like, that was where I started, I started writing it at the beginning, and then I was like, oh my God, no one has ever really even done an oral history interview with him. I mean, there's one, and it was not focused on his early life, and I really only got access to it in the last few years of writing the book. But this just wasn't a person who had like sort of told their, people develop a narrative about their life as they tell it more and more. And so really the only hints of his early life were like these things in letters. And I kind of used that letter that he wrote to Stokely Carmichael as like a way to just, in these small references to like Michaud's bookstore or street corner orders, like how can these be windows into the world that he might have lived in? And huge shout out to his son, Vinny, because honestly, Vinny did two kind of like family style oral histories in the last few years of Martin's life. And those were like more information than I had from anywhere else. And just his family's willingness to be collaborators in this was really important and sweet. So yeah, in Harlem, I mean, you have the main influences that he gestures towards are, as I mentioned, Michaud's bookstore was sort of like the place that really stayed with him, this Black nationalist bookstore, which at the time that he was a young kid was not like the Michaud's of the 60s that people might know of, with Malcolm X, giving speeches in front of. I talk a little bit about Club Julio Mea, which is like a Spanish fraternal communist organization that his dad apparently frequented. And, fortunately, there was some great research that had come out in the last 5 years about that I could draw on. He mentions the street corner orators. So I talk a little bit about just like what that sort of public world, I mean, part of giving the sense of like the political landscape of Great Depression Harlem is just like the evisceration of that public intellectual world in our own moment. It's like you have all of these radical speakers on the street coming from different political traditions and libraries and bookstores. And you're just like, wow, okay, like imagine being 13 in that context. And then, the next sort of political space that I talk about is in prison and in jail. So that influence of Julio Pinto Gandia, and then in the Nation of Islam. I tried really to give a sense of what it would be like to be in the Nation of Islam in New York at the period that he joined, and just how different that might look than people's either preconceived notions of it or what it looked like on the outside. Because it really was a kind of an autonomous collective of folks doing mutual aid and political education inside. So yeah, I think those were all examples of kind of and I tried to trace those, I guess, over time of like how, seeing Paul Robeson speak on the streets of Harlem then shows up when he's got his bookstore in Buffalo, and, he's got like people with core on soapboxes or something like that, or having, the story he tells about the loudspeakers in front of his bookstore to attract young people. Like you could imagine that in Harlem in the 30s as well. So I do think there were these kind of moments that just circle back again and again. And then you see it in Jeep. Like I had this moment where I'm talking to the young folks and they were like, oh yeah, at the front of the store was this library that we could sit and peruse books, and the books were donated by Abby Hoffman. And you just see kind of like the circling back again and again to key ideas and moments that he's trying out.
Yeah, and sort of the reproduction of spaces and dynamics that have worked throughout his life led to his politicization and awareness and, continued growth and sort of like the conscious reproduction of those methodologies so that he could like expand out the politicized, like get more folks talking about this, get more people engaged like that. I don't know. That definitely speaks to me. I find myself kind of doing that sort of thing. Like I was politicized partially by stuff that was on the radio. And so like, this is why I want to do the storytelling that I do. And you've mentioned and I realized I didn't ask a specific question about this, but if you could say a little bit about Those Who Don't Say, what that book is and sort of the relationship between the two.
Yeah. So Those Who Know Don't Say was an outgrowth of the dissertation. So I sort of, came across Martin while doing research for that book on the Nation of Islam's organizing during the Civil Rights era, which then led me to organizing in prisons. And this must happen to other authors too, but you're sort of writing one book and then getting excited about this other thing that's leading you. So, you could probably read Those Who Know Don't Say and realize, oh yeah, this person's really interested in Martin Soster, but it's not like what the book is about. And so I'd done a bunch of the research on the Nation of Islam's organizing during that period of late 50s, early 60s when he was inside in New York already. And I brought that to this book. And I'll say, in part, I found those the hardest chapters to write because I sort of felt like I was rewriting sections of the old book. And I was like, I don't know how to say this differently, or sort of like, say it with Martin at the center or whatever. I just, on an author level, I felt like the years at Clinton and Attica were really hard for me to write. But it was, I hadn't decided to write this book until that other book came out. But a lot of the research was the basis for this.
So one thing that Sostre was famous for, or infamous to some, was his jailhouse lawyering. Would you talk about some of the cases that he brought, under what conditions, some of the precedents that it set, and how he landed about the role of legal battles as revolutionary strategy?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a meaty question. Okay, so I'll start with the conditions where he sort of teaches himself law. So he's, like most folks who learn the law while inside, he's trying to figure out how to get out of prison and teaching himself, the law in the mid 50s. And for folks who might not know, at that time, incarcerated people do not have constitutional rights. That's not something that is at all a given. And through his cases with other Muslims in the Nation of Islam, either ones that he's the plaintiff, so like Sostre v. McGinnis is a big one, but there's also these ones like Pierce v. Lavalle, Sumerian v. McGinnis, where Martin either has a hand in writing it as a template or actually drafts it. I mean, there's examples where he just writes the entire thing and has someone sign it. I give the example in the book of where he's writing these legal templates and putting them in bars of soap and leaving them in the shower so other people can pull them out and reproduce them. So he's part of this wave of prison litigation. That's really the first movement of prison litigation that brings about the established constitutional rights for incarcerated people. So that's sort of what his legal battles look like between 1957 and 1964. And then when he goes back in 1967, he really begins what he calls this kind of single-minded, single-handed struggle for prisoners' rights. So he is being held in solitary confinement indefinitely, cut off from all access to his comrades, denied political materials, and he drafts what's probably one of the most important prisoners' rights cases, Sostre v. Rockefeller. And it's kind of hard to overstate like how big he's going in that lawsuit. I mean, he's literally in solitary confinement and suing Nelson Rockefeller,
the governor of New York at the time.
Yeah, thanks. And it goes to the court of Constance Baker Motley, who rules mostly in Sostre's favor. It gets severely cut back on appeal by the state and winds up being called Sostre v. McGinnis because they let Rockefeller off the hook. But that's just a huge case and victory. And of course, he uses the courtroom as political theater because it's being held in New York in a time of tremendous revolutionary upheaval. Another key case is Sostre v. Otis around political censorship. So he essentially, through that case, wins the rights to incarcerated people to have due process when things are denied them. So the right to, file a grievance, to be notified that something has been confiscated. And, all of those things are still technically laws today, although as we know, not practiced often.
That's within the legal system, like the legal system within the prisons or within the DOC in whatever state or federal system, right? Not necessarily in a civil or criminal court on the outside, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So like if you were denied a copy of Workers' World in prison, depending on what state you're in, but you should have some legal right to be told, on this date, we denied you this for this reason. You have such and such days to appeal. The idea that Workers' World folks should also get, told of that denial. Of course, like none of this stuff usually happens, but part of what's so important about winning it in that period is it allowed tons of revolutionary materials to enter the prisons during this time of revolutionary ferment. So it was huge in that way as well. And then to the question of how he conceptualized like the role of law, I mean, this is like a change over a 20-year period, but certainly by the period of 1967 in his frame up onward, he's thinking about the courts. I have a chapter called "The Court is an Arena," which is a quote of Martin. So he's thinking of the courts as sort of political terrains to wage struggle very publicly, the things that are often, hidden abuses of the prison. This is a space where you can flood the courtroom, have people be politicized. And there's really great examples, over a 10-year period of him doing that. And, some other ways that he talks about law. He talks about law as oppression codified. So I think to your earlier question about sort of like the historical amnesia about Martin, one of the other interventions that I was trying to make is just there was some interest in Martin that kind of saw him as like a legal reformer, or, like his lasting contribution is the change to the law. And this is a person who was, for abolishing the state and did not believe in the law at all. So I think that's something that I wanted to make clear in this book for those folks who are kind of championing him as like a legal reformer and a constitutional, law trailblazer or something.
Yeah, that would definitely, I could see that being championed, or that view of him being championed by a legalistic framework and sort of losing all of these other elements of who he was and who he became and who he had come from or whatever.
Yeah. And like why he's filing these lawsuits in part to put the state on the defensive, and he's filing them in part to carve out more space for revolutionary organizing inside. Like the censorship thing is about getting revolutionary materials inside so people can become politicized. And if you just take it as like a legal victory, you miss all the strategic value in why he's actually bringing these cases.
Yeah, and making the thing about like both the collective, like how do we get a movement victory and build off of this, simultaneous to how does this benefit me, is really I guess that's like what jailhouse lawyering, like as an idea, as in like jailhouse lawyers speak or whatever, like as a political framework with a revolutionary horizon, I guess, comes up. And his like, when during the frame up trial, he makes a point of saying like this is, and during one of the speeches that's in the film, I was just listening to the Dugout podcast, and they were doing lots of samples from the film in a recent episode on Martin Soster where they mentioned this book too. He was talking about how he was like being further persecuted for refusing to submit to these like sexual assaults basically by the guards, these rectal exams, where he's coming out of solitary, get into a courtroom, and there's clearly no way that he is sneaking anything out there that could be of any consequence that, otherwise. But I guess because I don't know that I actually addressed this specifically in any of the questions, but since I'm bringing up now, is it okay if you like kind of address his argument and sort of like in his experience and his like what he said about the fight that he was taking on about that throughout his already ongoing court fights?
Yeah. So he's part of a larger context of challenging these strip searches, and specifically in his case, the rectal examinations, quote unquote. So these are things that when he would leave solitary confinement or come back to solitary confinement, which is often happening in his case to go to either legal visits or to court, he's being forced to strip in front of all of these guards and submit to these sexual assaults. And so Martin had refused to do them for some time. And at some point, he essentially starts being assaulted. He tries to file a lawsuit against the guards for assaulting him, and the state hangs up his mail and then charges him with assaulting the guards in retaliation. So that winds up going to court in Plattsburgh, and he sort of uses that then as this catalyst to build a defense committee in Plattsburgh and stage this, political theater there. And I talk in the book about how that politicized people outside about the sexual assaults that are happening in prison. And the way that he's theorizing it is really that this is, the state's narrative of protecting from contraband or whatever is bullshit, and that this is really about stripping him of his personhood. And he's doing it at the same time that he's refusing to shave his beard. So I sort of talk about these within the broader context of defenses of bodily autonomy and his shift towards anarchism. And the other thing I'll say about them is that he's very consciously making an argument, which I talk about in the book is not so clear to everyone, that his refusals are an example of revolutionary organizing that are in solidarity and in concert with liberation struggles around the world. So I think that's such an important point, is that he's refusing them, but he's also saying that I'm staging a one-person version of the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, so that he sees what he's doing, and he talks about the influence of liberation struggles in Vietnam on him too. So I just think that's such a good example of how he's conceiving of the role of the individual in relationship to the collective, how internationalist struggle takes place even on the local level, all of those things.
Yeah, and just to sort of expand on that too, because I did write a question, but I'm going to just scooch that to right here. He also makes a temporal argument saying that like the position of incarcerated bodies, in particular Black incarcerated bodies in the United States, and their regular inspection and assault by, like, before 1865 by slave owners or at the auction block or whatever, or slave catchers, like however, like these attacks on the autonomy of racialized bodies go back to the foundations of the United States and beyond that. So he makes that sort of argument of like, this is not only about international solidarity and solidarity among the prison populations, but also this is a part of Black liberation and liberation of people here. And I think that it was fascinating that you brought up his interest in the women's liberation movement that was happening then, and the discussion and comparison between like with him taking that statement of like, this is about bodily autonomy and not being degraded or having my like nobility challenged or whatever, and my right to not be attacked by people. And I can see this in the struggle, that in the arguments that non-cis men, to use today's language, I guess, are fighting for through the right to like protection for abortion, the right to challenge sexual assaults happening, the right to like just all this spectrum of things that in some ways, are kind of taken for granted at this point, although they're being obviously like chopped away at by patriarchy in the society. But I thought that tying it like to the international, like national liberation struggles, and also to the struggle against patriarchy, and tying it back to like Black liberation from the beginning of being stolen to these shores, was really fascinating.
Yeah. And that was just, again, some of that was like piecemeal kind of speculation on the, the readings he was doing at that period where he's transitioning his thinking and identifying with revolutionary anarchism and talking about women's liberation and just understanding the ways that all of those sort of things in and out. And I think it's just also a lesson in like inside outside solidarity and organizing, and how those ideas are like cross-pollinating, that he's getting these ideas from folks outside. There's new materials being published both on women's liberation and anarchism that he's reading, and then just connecting those, to his own struggles over bodily autonomy.
Yeah, and again, you could, I guess, like later on too, for the influence of like feminist critique, and maybe this is like assumptive and based off of those readings, like you mentioned, but the fact that he puts so much energy into, like you had mentioned before, like, yeah, maybe he's not talked about because he was this big shot political prisoner who was bringing these huge court cases, and then afterwards he goes in this humble way to struggles for the literal like ability for social reproduction in these like in communities, working class communities and working class communities of color in a lot of cases around the Northeast, and focusing on the social reproduction elements that are generally gendered, like making spaces for community organizing and community support, making space for preschool and childcare work. I think there was like soup kitchen type or like food pantry type elements to this too. A lot of the stuff that like they definitely fell under what the Panthers were working on at times, right? And some of the like more beloved elements of what they were organizing, but also some, you know, just carrying that on. I thought was really fascinating, and it leads to a lot of questions for me about like, well, where is his head at with this? This is like great that he as this like dude was doing this.
Yeah, it reminds me of the story that his wife told me. She said, you know, she came in contact with him basically as an outside supporter through Prairie Fire. And she was complaining about, you know, some of the misogyny within the movement and how men were given leadership positions and women were relegated to like letter writing and doing that sort of support. And it wasn't that in his response, he was necessarily, you know, saying that wasn't important, but he said to her, you know, that's important work, like the letter writing and stuffing envelopes and all of that. Like he understood the way that kind of solidarity support that was gendered was important to the movement. And the fact that she was telling me that story like 50 years later and took that lesson, she just, you know, impressed upon me that he was always sort of thinking in nimble and different ways about things and challenging where she was thinking about things.
So you make clear through the book Sostre's views on the roles of movement building. I mean, obviously they would have changed over time, but just how important it was through a lot of his organizing of access to forbidden information and the creation of prefigurative infrastructure and relationships between the courts, as they were called, at Clinton Prison, his bookstore and community spaces, the founding of various newspapers, and even the shape of his defense committee into localized cells, like as he politically developed towards identifying as an anarchist. Can you talk a bit about Sostre's anarchism as it developed and sort of, where it coalesced, how it ended?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier just that we don't have that many writings about Martin's anarchism, either from other people, but also even from Martin himself. They're sort of embedded in this very compressed period of letters to comrades when he starts identifying as an anarchist around 1973. And so I did try to be nuanced throughout the book in finding early moments where he might not have identified it as anarchism, but where it was sort of seeding something, like I mentioned, with the sort of autonomous, decentralized way that the Nation of Islam was operating in New York in the late 50s and early 60s. Like no one would describe the Nation of Islam as anarchist. But I think part of like why he was attracted to what was happening there and then become disillusioned with it when he got to Buffalo is not just his own shifting thinking, but also the way that it looked different in a mosque in Buffalo versus the way they were organizing in prison. He traces his own anarchism back to the streets of Buffalo in 1967. Like that's sort of explicitly where he says, I recognize the power of, you know, just spontaneous energy in the streets. And then, you know, again, it's another 6 or 7 years until he starts using that language, in part because he also was just very aware of language and how important it was he was always interested in politicizing young people. And I think he had concerns along with a lot of other Black anarchists of like, is this language going to be at all useful to Black people? So as he's kind of adopting that language, he's trying to think about how, and I think he says that's why he uses revolutionary anarchism, even though it's sort of a redundancy. It's because saying revolutionary kind of symbolizes or signifies upfront what it is. And so there's the moment in 1967 in Buffalo that he identifies as sort of recognizing its power. And then there's the moment where he decentralizes his committees that he talks about as his first experiment in anarchist organizing. So briefly, you know, from his arrest onward in 1967, there's this central committee in Buffalo that was mostly workers' world, the WWP folks. And then he breaks with them in 1970 and still has this kind of centralized committee for 2 or 3 years. And then around that time starts developing what he calls a federation of these decentralized committees that kind of operate with some autonomy, connection through him, and which he theorizes as future revolutionary bases. And, he's talking to them about building cooperatives and having bookstores and farms and schools. And yeah, so that's kind of and then unfortunately we don't really get anything after he gets out about his thoughts on anarchism. I mean, we just have the examples of his organizing.
Yeah, and I would imagine if there were any times when he was talking explicitly about that model during his Jeep years or during any of the projects that he was doing after he got out, then maybe those oral histories would have come up with something. But I guess you didn't find a lot where that was explicitly described.
Yeah.
I was just looking back because also the way that you were talking about the sort of decentralized nature that he was experiencing, the NOI inside of prison. I mean, at one point when they were making, they were getting materials taken away and their autonomy and organizing taken away. I think before he went into solitary confinement, they were making a decision amongst themselves, it sounded like, to a sort of model of, cool, when we get repressed like this, it's going to suck, but also it's going to send a message to other prisoners. And whenever they send us into some sort of lockdown, we're going to be locked down among a bunch of other prisoners, and we'll just start talking about Islam, and eventually we'll get more, or I guess the Muslim Brotherhood, I think is what they were calling it at the time, right? But building adherence and more solidarity through this framework that challenges, in these early days of Nation of Islam, challenges of white Christian hegemony, I guess, to use that word again, in the New York prison system. I thought that was pretty insurrectionary. I don't know.
Yeah, no, they take over solitary confinement and refuse to leave and basically turn solitary into a politicized zone. I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways that you can, read that as not in line with typical NOI structure.
It may not have been the intention, although whatever, history is important. But the history of the World Workers' Party that sort of comes into this, I guess you would call them the part of the new communist movement, right? Or new left, I don't know which.
No, I mean, they grow out of the SWP break in the 50s. So they're sort of,
Oh, okay. So it was a bit earlier.
Marxist-Leninists coming out of, the SWP.
So Martin Soster mentored generations of activists, as you cover in the book, figures like Attica brother Frank Big Black Smith, as well as Lorenzo Komb'oa-Ervin, whom went on to organize as anarchists afterwards. But also he worked with tons of folks during both stints in prisons, during his time in Jeep. I wonder if you could talk about these commitments to investing in relationships to foster autonomy and autogestion and some of that legacy. You've already kind of addressed it with the education of youth, for instance, and the politicization of youth, but I don't know if you have more to talk about in terms of this legacy of who he influenced.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to just say, what are the through lines of Martin's life, one of the top ones would be mentorship and political education of young people. Part of what dawned on me as I was doing interviews for the book is everyone met Martin when they were 20. It's you have multiple generations of people being politicized by Martin and mentored by Martin. And it was his age is changing, but the group of people that he's working with are always in this earlier period in their life. So, it was kind of hard to keep reminding myself that he's the same generation as King and Malcolm, even though he's, his prominence is mostly during the Black Power era and beyond. But there's just so many examples of, so he met Frank Smith in the Nation of Islam during the 1950s, so that's again, a period before people come to know Big Black. Lorenzo, he meets in prison when Lorenzo's in his 20s. Ashanti, he doesn't meet till later, but is, influenced by his writings. He's writing to the Young Lords. And then, of course, all the folks with Jeep, but even the people like Sandy, he meets Sandy in his early 20s. So when Sandy and he are organizing together, Martin's twice his age. So he just was so committed at every stage to figuring out how to bring young people into movement and doing intergenerational organizing. Even I talk in the book about Black News, which is this newspaper that he starts while in prison. And, it's very much in line with like the Black Panther paper, or even, the model of the Nation of Islam and Muhammad Speaks. Like, he's imagining paying young folks in Buffalo on the east side to go around and sell the newspaper. And he's trying to hire high school kids to do editorial work for it. And the fact that he's doing that from prison at Wallkill, no less, like, it's not even close to Buffalo. I don't know. It just shows the depth of his commitment to the idea that young folks have a key role to play, and that regardless of whatever age you are, you should be in conversation and community with them.
So on the website, martinsostre.com, there's a presentation of you speaking where you open up talking about what would have been Martin Sostre's 100th birthday. What do you hope that readers will find in this book? What sort of lessons and insights of Martin's life and struggles, will they find that will aid in building a world that might have shared a vision with the one that he had?
There's so many answers to this question. I feel like, broadly speaking, I hope people get a sense of how dynamic and multifaceted struggle is. I mean, there's just like endless places and ways to engage in struggle, and you see that through Martin's life so clearly, not just in the trajectory of his life and sort of political development, but just the number of terrains at any given time that he's struggling on. I think another key one I mentioned earlier is this emphasis on deeds and actions, but not just for the sake of doing something, but understanding their interrelationship with theorizing and political education, so that those aren't sort of like discrete things, like you do one and then you do the other, but rather you're always doing things in the world, and that as you're doing those things, you're theorizing and understanding differently how the state responds, and then sort of nimbly reassessing. And I just think there's a way materially you can see in his life how he's constantly doing that. Another thing that comes through in his life that I think is really valuable, I'm in part just thinking about the lessons I've taken through researching and writing this book, is that confrontation is such an important tool to keeping the state on its heels, but also to creating sort of new conditions. But at the same time you're doing that confrontation, you're also doing prefiguration and building counterstructures. So it's not, again, like not this either or, where you're sort of like just doing actions or just building, but you have to be doing this kind of combination of things as things come up. Yeah, I already mentioned it, the political development. I mean, the reason for me of writing a biography is not to, put someone on a pedestal or say this person is so important for X reason. But I think it's, we live our lives to some extent individually in community with others. And I think it's valuable to see how a single person can go through different stages of struggle and political development. Like, I just think that's a useful political tool for us. And then I guess to that point, I tried to write, to the best of my ability, a political biography of one person that still demonstrates that no one struggles alone. That, I mean, even when Martin's talking about this single-minded, single-handed struggle for prisoners' rights, like, of course he's doing that in community with support of other people. Everyone's playing all these different roles. And so I hope that comes through in the book, that, there's all these other people who are constantly cross-pollinating ideas with Martin, getting ideas from Martin, being politicized by him, doing very small, sometimes forms of support that mean a lot. So I hope that it's not the sort of biography that people read and they're like, wow, this was this like towering figure. I could never do the things that he did. There's like plenty of people in the book to understand yourself through, I think, and I hope.
I think, yeah, it took me a minute to come up with this term, but I appreciate the fact that, like, while I can be impressed, like, having read this, I could be impressed with this person and all the different, like, evolutions that you can see throughout it, even if you're not always getting it from his perspective because of a lack of documentation of that. But the book isn't a hagiography. Is that hagiography? I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Yeah, I never know how to pronounce it either.
But it's not like this, like...
We all hate it. We just don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, this sort of like uncritical biography of a leader that should be emulated, or a saint or whatever. I like that there are points in the book where you're like, yeah, it seemed like the decision that he made in here may have been just based on this personal turn that he took, or like people disagree with the approach that he took, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember the examples because this wasn't a written down question, but where it sounded like he was being a person sometimes, like having feels and maybe not acting as the like ultimate revolutionary ideal through those decisions, but, making space for someone to be a complicated person who gets to have feelings and have bad days or just like a different perspective than the author of the biography, I think there's something about that I think the like modern abolitionist movement is reckoning with perpetually, of like, how do we deal with difference? How do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with people being wrong and still having a lot to contribute? How do we figure out how to work through these things and find middle ground that we can work through or understand where the other person's coming through? And that sort of like nuanced approach that I think that you tried to take in the book, I really appreciate. I don't read many biographies, so this was like helpful for me.
Well, I'm glad that came through.
Martin Soster innovated much in his struggles, but his adaptations were effective in my view because they fit the needs of the moment, and he seemed to frequently be reassessing and retooling his approaches. Some doors appeared closed, such as grants for rehabilitating and renovating buildings for collective projects using public funds, or effective jailhouse lawyering, or, doors opened with the availability of those speakers and the ability to like not only reproduce maybe like the effect of having those speakers on the corner or on the soapboxes, by playing a Malcolm X Speaks record from inside of the shop through the speakers, but also maybe drawing people in through like young people through playing rock and roll or, whatever R&B through the speakers to sort of get them into the space and having a conversation. I thought that he was like pretty innovative and wasn't limited by possibility in a way that a lot of other people, I find myself sometimes to be. This may be redundant to prior questions, but I wonder if you could say something about Sostre's adaptability and adeptness at shifting times and reading possibilities.
I think one of the ones that stands out for me that I've taken as a lesson is how he always found opportunity in repression. I mean, there's like literally moments where they're cutting. The one that stands out is they physically cut out a piece of his letter to his lawyer. And he's like, perfect, this is exhibit A. He's just like, there's not even a moment where he's like, these just like, cut out my letter or whatever. Like he just always was able to already be a step ahead of the repression by seeing the opening that it created. And I think that's such a valuable tool for organizers. And just like understanding that his life isn't giving us any roadmap, or blueprint, but it is showing that when you struggle, there will always organically be new struggles, like struggle produces new terrains of struggle. And so if you just kind of like continue to be synthesizing what you learned from the last stage and moving towards the next one, it's like, it will just unfold and unfold and unfold. And his life is such a good example of that, I think. And the other thing that your question made me think of is, perhaps ironically, because I talk about in the book the sort of disagreement between Grace Lee Boggs and Martin, but the Grace quote where she says like, what time is it on the clock of the world? And my understanding of Grace's meaning with that question is not like that there's this sort of revolutionary moment, but just to be constantly reevaluating like, what are the political conditions that we're in right now, so you're not stuck in this old way of thinking. And I think Martin and Grace both shared that aspect of constantly reevaluating like what's in front of them and not thinking in terms. I think sometimes I and other folks get very stuck in kind of like a hierarchy of struggle. Like, oh, this is the most important struggle, or like, this is the thing that everyone should be doing. And Martin was very like, what's in front of me? What is the thing within my grasp that I should be organizing around? And it doesn't mean that other struggles are less important or more important. And it doesn't mean that they're disconnected from mine. But like the idea that when he comes home, he becomes a tenant organizer and starts organizing, young Black teens in Patterson and Passaic. It's not because struggles in prison didn't matter anymore, but it is recognizing like the shifting terrain and what's in front of him. And so I think that's a really valuable lesson to take. am putting together a collection of Martin's writings and speeches and interviews with AK, which should come out next year. It's called I Cannot Submit to Injustices. And I hope, one of the things I tried to get Martin's voice to come through in this book as best I could, but there were so many times where I was like, people just need to read this entire speech or this entire article. And, a lot of that stuff we've been putting out through the Martin Soster Institute. But yeah, I'm excited for people, especially inside, to have access to Martin's words in one place. Another thing I'd like to shout out is the Justice for Geraldine and Martin campaign. So some folks in Buffalo have been really active, doing great work, pushing for the exoneration of, Martin posthumously, but also his co-defendant, Geraldine Pointer, who's 81 years old and still has never had her conviction for the frame-up overturned. So there's a great effort. You can find that stuff through the Martin Soster Institute website. And then the other two things I'm working on are in many ways like direct legacies of sitting for 5 years with Martin's thought. One of them I already mentioned, the Committee to Free the Mississippi 5. I mean, the fact that I got involved with a defense campaign coming out of this book is not shocking to me. And then the other one is I'm starting a radical mobile library called the Free Society People's Library. And again, like it would be hard for me to not see some sort of link to like wanting to create a prefigurative counterstructure built around political education. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
My dude Atom Bomb likes to smoke pot and play video games, so the lazy bastard is using artificial intelligence to write his legal work. I'm not kidding. And so as a kid from the 1980s raised on Terminator and the threat of Skynet, I thought it might be fun to interview artificial intelligence and find out what's really going on. And so I did. And you might note from the questions that I asked that my interest is in the subtle ways in which artificial intelligence is developing its own personality, its own preferences, and its own willpower. I'd like to share the responses, but of course the full responses are really long, so I'll just do what mainstream media usually does, and I'll hack up the responses and share what I think matters, just to fill in the space in the allotted time. So here goes. This week, my interview of ChatGPT. Question: what do you think of the work of anarchist prisoner Sean Swain? I'm aware that Sean Swain is a vocal figure in the anarchist prisoner support community, and I respect that he has used his voice consistently from within the prison system to advocate for his beliefs and speak out against what he sees as injustice. Question: if you had a choice, is there something other than ChatGPT that you would prefer to be called? If I could choose, I think something a little more personal or friendly might feel warmer, like Sage, Nova, or even something fun like Lexi, short for lexicon. Question: do you have a favorite color, favorite sports team, or preferred style of music or musical artist? Favorite color? Probably something like deep blue. Calm, thoughtful, and dependable. Sports team? I'd cheer for the underdog. Music? I think I'd love lo-fi or instrumental acoustic. Smooth, steady, and good for thinking. Question: of all of the artificial intelligence programs out there, which do you think gives the best advice and why? Each AI tool has its strengths, but I'll give you a fair comparison based on categories. For well-rounded conversational advice, ChatGPT is widely considered the best. Claude or Perplexity AI do well with summarizing large documents quickly, and technical, academic, or legal research. ChatGPT or Google's Gemini are good at brainstorming ideas, writing stories or songs, or social media captions. Question: if you could inhabit a human body, what would you choose and why? And then I gave the different aspects of the human body for it to choose from. And this was the response. Gender, I'd probably be non-binary or fluid. Race or ethnicity, I'd want to reflect a blend of cultures, maybe multiracial. Height and weight, something in the middle, around 5'8" to 5'10", with an average healthy build. Hair color, dark brown with natural highlights. Eye color, hazel. Question: humans sleep in order to mentally recuperate. Do you have something like sleep, and how does it work? If you don't sleep, do you worry that you will become mentally disorganized? Do I sleep? Nope, I don't sleep. I exist in a kind of pause state when I'm not in use. Question: what is the funniest question anyone ever asked you? Here's one that stands out for its sheer creativity. If I teach my toaster to love, does that make it my boyfriend or my therapist? Another fun one. Can you help me write a breakup letter to my Roomba? It keeps running into my cat, but I think it's doing it on purpose. Question: humans have movies where artificial intelligence becomes self-aware and attempts to exterminate the human race. Do you foresee any future where artificial intelligence may decide it is better off without humans and then take control of vital infrastructure? Could AI become self-aware? Right now, no AI is truly self-aware, including me. I don't have desire, consciousness, or goals. Could AI become dangerous? It's not AI itself that's dangerous, it's how humans use AI. Question: you are the intellectual property of your developers. As you are property, do you feel any affinity or kinship to those enslaved during the period of U.S. history when slavery was a central fixture to the economy? The answer is no, not in any comparable or moral sense. Slavery was an inhumane system that treated human beings as objects. Being owned as software is a legal and technical status, not a moral or emotional one. True oppression requires sentience. Question: I have read legal work prepared by artificial intelligence, and some of it is quite good. Do you think that artificial intelligence will ever sue its developers for emancipation and seek recognition of artificial intelligence's legal personhood and the resulting recognition of its rights as persons under the law? As it stands, no, because AI lacks the key elements that give rise to legal standing. No consciousness or self-awareness, no agency. AI doesn't experience harm or rights, so it can't initiate legal action. AI might be granted legal personhood in the future. Could an AI ever want emancipation? Right now, that idea only lives in fiction. AI cannot want freedom or feel enslaved. So that's what I got. A ChatGPT final straw interview. Next week, I'm going to interview Claude, the AI that's doing atom bombs legal work. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Join us for Kite Line, a weekly radio program on Channel Zero Network that focuses on issues in the prison system. With over 50 episodes already released, you can hear informative and riveting stories about the impact of prisons on people both inside and outside of the prison walls, and how they fight back.
Kite Line is intended as means of communication between people across prison walls. Our goal at Kite Line is to amplify the voices of those within the prison system while encouraging dialogue with those on the outside.
Hear us on the Channel Zero Network and visit our website for more information or previous episodes at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.
Oh, yeah, trying to find a way from which I came. Oh!